This is a video for 5.2 over animal tissues, and we're continuing with connective tissue in this screen capture video. One of the definitions for connective tissue is a group of cells that are found in a non-living matrix, and that could be a solid non-living matrix such as bone or cartilage, or it could be in a liquid non-living matrix where you have red blood cells, white blood cells, and mostly water, what we call blood. There are some types of connective tissue that I'm not mentioning. One is the dense connective tissue. If you go on and take anatomy physiology, you can learn more about that. I don't have much to say about loose connective tissue, except that one text that I was using as a reference claims that it's the most abundant type of connective tissue. But beyond that, you can research that on your own, or if you take anatomy physiology, you can learn more about the loose connective tissue. Looking at some of the cells, there's not a lot to see that really stands out to a person just seeing the slides for the first time, so I didn't put any image of loose connective tissue up. Adipose tissue. We all have this, some people more so than others, but this is very important for a number of reasons. I have an image of what would be seen through a microscope of stained adipose cells. They're filled with lipid, and these cells enlarge as they're filled with lipid, and that lipid pushes the nucleus, and you can see the nucleus stained in some of these off to the sides of the cells where it's been pushed off to the side. The lipid inside the cell just pushes the other organelles off to the side, including the nucleus, and fills the cell with lipid, and these cells enlarge. And so for a very heavy person, they would have enlarged adipose cells. And I remember being told when I was in high school, and I've asked some anatomy physiology people about this, that for every pound a person is overweight, the blood has to travel an extra mile in the body. And so as people put on extra weight and they have the extra poundage, for every pound overweight, the blood has to pump an extra mile. It's understandable why people that are overweight have heart problems, and why you don't tend to see elderly people that are morbidly obese. You will find some exceptions, but they tend to not be long-lived. That's true of large people in general, even if they're not especially fat. And there are different understandings, different explanations. The one that I've heard most is that a larger person has a greater blood supply. The heart has to work harder to pump that blood throughout the body because of their larger size and volume, and the heart doesn't last as long. The membrane of the fat cells does stain, and that's why you see the purple in this image. Some of the purposes for lipid for adipose tissue would be for stored energy. It's a great way of storing energy. Animals, mammals, will tend to put on extra fat in the fall of the year. If you're a deer hunter and you were to harvest a deer in this area or much of the Midwest, they're well fed, they have a lot of corn and soybeans, and when you go to butcher them, you notice that they have inches of fat on them from the fat that they're storing up, and they tend to do that to make it through the winter months, though usually they don't have much trouble finding food in this area. In higher elevations and further north, food is more of a problem in the winter. Also, fat serves as padding, and we don't think about this so much, but it serves as padding in our mesentery to protect our internal organs around the intestines, and also behind the eyes. And if you've ever seen a person that is on a very strict diet, or they're starving, or they're fasting for a long period of time, used to be true of wrestlers. I think they've stopped that in high school now, where wrestlers aren't allowed to cut so much weight. But when they go on strict diets or stop eating for several days, they become very thin. You can see the ribs, and you would notice their eyes would tend to sink in, and that's true of those that are starving to death. You see pictures from third world countries in most cases where they don't have enough to eat, and their eyes sink in because they're losing that padding behind their eyes. That padding helps because if the eye is bumped or if our internal organs are bumped, there's some give or some cushion to help protect us so it's not just pushed up against bone. The adipose serves as insulation. If you've ever been on a strict diet or you've fasted for many days, you've lost a lot of weight and you've lost most of your fat, you would realize that it is more difficult to stay warm. You have to start putting on more layers of clothing. You gain that weight back and you notice, wow, I don't have to wear several shirts or sweatshirts or coats. But without that adipose, it's a little bit harder to stay warm. It's noticeable. And that's something we see in animals of the Arctic. You think of the mammals of the sea, such as whales, walruses, seals. They tend to have a lot of adipose tissue, which we call blubber, which not only serves as energy, but also helps insulate them. I oftentimes tell my face-to-face students stories when I'm talking about the biology. I don't tend to tell as many stories with the online class. But back in the 1970s, there were 3 fishermen from the Midwest. I think at least one of them was from Illinois. And the one that survived told my dad the story, and then my dad told me. They took a trip to northwestern Ontario. It was in the spring of the year after the ice had gone off the lake, and they had rented a boat and motor from a lodge and took off across the lake, and were not experienced with the lake and weather, and didn't know that when the wind picked up, it was best just to go back to an island and wait out the storm, even if you have to wait overnight. But they were there for just a short time, maybe a week, and they wanted to get as much fishing in as they could, and so they stayed out on the lake longer than they should, and they finally decided with the Whitecaps, a small boat, probably about 14, 16 foot long, they decided they're going to try to make it back to the lodge across the lake, probably a few miles. And while they're boating across the lake, their boat capsized from the wind and the waves, and if I remember correctly, there were 3 men. All 3 went into the lake. One of them apparently drowned rather quickly, and 2 were left. One was a fairly heavy man, quite overweight, and then there's his buddy. They held onto the boat, and the overweight man was the one that told my father the story. He grabbed a hold of his buddy when his buddy became unconscious from hypothermia and held on to him as long as he could, and eventually just couldn't keep a grip on him, and his buddy slipped out of his arms, went under, and that was the last he saw of him. The man that was heavy, who had the extra insulation, stayed with the boat, eventually got to land, I think it was an island, and was able to get up on the island, and he told my dad that he started a fire and used gasoline from the tank that was still floating with the boat, and caught some of his clothes on fire, but it felt so good. It felt so good to feel the warmth. He just let it burn for several seconds. Eventually, a search party was sent out, and maybe it was the next day, I don't recall, and they found him. They found one of the men relatively soon. I think the 3rd man that died was about 2 weeks later. But it's thought that because that one man was overweight, he had all that extra insulation, it helped him to survive in the cold, cold water. Water's probably in the 30s, 40 degree Fahrenheit range. That would be an extreme example of it, but it's one that drives home the example of insulation. Even though that's not necessarily healthy for a human to be overweight, it helped that one individual. Nerve development is something that's important. The nerve cells are developed from the fat cells, and if a child, if a baby is very thin, if they're starving, they do not have proper development of their brain cells, and that follows them throughout life and limits their neural development. And that's a big concern, especially in third world countries. That's one of the reasons why pictures show these small children. They're more drastically affected by starving than adults are, because that comes into play in their neural development. A baby, a young child, has to have a minimum amount of body fat in order to have proper brain development. It's also important with puberty, especially in females. For a female to enter puberty, for her to begin menses, she has to have a minimum amount of body fat. And this is interesting because some countries have taken advantage of this with their Olympics. Where, some people pay more attention to the Olympics than others, but the Summer Olympics, where they have gymnastics, back in the 1970s, the Romanians were the international power in female gymnastics. And it was later learned that the Romanians would put their young gymnasts on strict diets. And they usually would start the girls very young in their gymnastics routines, find out which ones were best, put them on strict diets. And by putting them on strict diets, it kept them from developing enough fat to where they would enter puberty. And when they'd enter puberty, there's a change in the center of balance. And that is a drastic change for a gymnast because they're used to doing the routines based on their body size, their center of balance. You change that center of balance and it's a big adjustment. And so the Romanians had some understanding of that and would put their young female gymnasts on strict diets. My understanding is that the Chinese do that also. The next connective tissue is blood that I want to mention. And with blood, it has several important characteristics. One is it carries oxygen, carbon dioxide. We're constantly producing that. The cells around our body are. We tend to think of our muscles producing it, but other parts of our body also produce carbon dioxide and use oxygen. Our brain, especially when we're studying, uses quite a bit of oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. Another thing that blood does is it fights foreign substances. And anything that's foreign to the body is considered to be an antigen. And we develop antibodies from our immune system, white blood cells, to help fight those. Also, blood carries nutrients and waste, and it helps to regulate body temperature. With the regulation of body temperature, if you're considering the winter months, a part of the body that people leave uncovered that we're told in the news and by people that understand survival in cold weather tell us to cover is the head. And we have a rich blood flow to the head with the carotid arteries, and then the jugular veins carry the blood back toward the heart. Our brain needs quite a bit of oxygen. It shuts down if there's not enough oxygen. So we have a rich blood flow. And rich blood flow means movement of heat from our core, from our chest and stomach area to other parts. And so if we're wanting to conserve heat energy, we're told to cover our head. I'll tell you a story that I tell my face-to-face students. If a person is stabbed in the neck or their carotid artery or jugular vein is severed, it oftentimes means death. There's an account of a driver that was driving out east, perhaps in Pennsylvania. He was driving along and his family hit a buck deer. He stopped and he walked up to a farmhouse, and the farmer grabbed his knife and said he was interested in dressing the deer. They walked back down to where the deer was lying along the road, and the farmer grabbed hold of the front legs and he had the driver stab the deer's neck. And the driver made the comment, "Wow, there's a lot of blood from that deer." And the farmer said, "That's not the deer, that's me." What the driver didn't see was that the blood was coming from the farmer. And what had happened when the driver stabbed the deer in the neck, some reflex occurred, and the deer jerked its head, and one of the tines of its antlers stabbed the farmer in the neck and pierced or severed one of his blood vessels, major blood vessels, and he fell over and died on the spot. Kind of a gruesome story, but it helps to illustrate the rich blood flow to the body. When I come back in the next video, I'll talk about different types of blood cells.